President Biden continued his busy week in the Middle East, where he is spending time in Israel. In an interview with Israeli news channel 12, he defended the country as a democratic state and ally, as well as dismissing concerns from some progressive Democratic lawmakers about Israel's conflict with Palestine. Let's listen.
Israel is a democracy. Israel is our ally. Israel is a friend. And I think that I make no apologies. We've provided for, in my administration, $4 billion plus another billion for Iron Dome. And we're working on a laser project to be able to replace Iron Dome. It's overwhelming our interest that Israel be stable.
Israel Defense Forces welcomed Biden, saying, quote, "Together we strengthen the ties between our nations and allies in the region." Here to discuss Biden's visit to Israel is Aaron Maté, reporter and host of the Pushback, airing on the Gray Zone. Welcome, Aaron.
Good to be here.
Aaron, is there anything surprising about the tone that Biden struck in those remarks and during this visit?
No. Recall that Joe Biden was supposed to be this massive sea change from Donald Trump. But when it comes to the Middle East, I can't see one tangible difference. It's the exact same policy. The only potential difference was back on the campaign trail when Biden promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah. Well, what's happening now on this trip? After Israel, he's going to Saudi Arabia, where he will be kissing the feet of Mohammed bin Salman to get him to open up more oil shipments because of the disaster resulting from the proxy war in Ukraine. So on the Middle East, Biden is in lockstep with Trump. And so that means on a country like Israel, where Trump openly embraced his fidelity, he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, Biden's pursuing the exact same policies. And accordingly, he's making statements such as calling a country where millions of people, indigenous people, whose land was stolen from them, the Palestinians, live under military occupation. He's calling that a democracy, which nobody takes seriously anymore. If you look at all the major human rights groups, B'Tselem, which is Israeli, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they all call Israel what it is, which is an apartheid state. And in fact, it's worse than apartheid if you look at the reality of what Israel does in the West Bank and Gaza.
But I mean, what can we? Aren't we talking about the limits of U.S. power really to shape domestic policies in other countries? To be the world police, to call out bad actors, and I think probably what you want and what you want, Brianna, and I think what I would want as well would be less hypocrisy here. If we're going to, how can we condemn a Russia, a Venezuela, et cetera, and then we embrace regimes that have not exactly the same, but other problems or other mistreatments of groups. We're saying these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, when it's so much more confusing than that. And so that's why you end up seeing this continuity, because they just pick from one president to another. They just pick different countries that are our friends and different ones that are not, and then they cloak it in this guise of humanitarian consideration when it's actually never about that. It's about what do we think is in our best interest, although then what the government thinks is in the best interest is I think they're utterly wrong about half the time.
Well, look, I agree with the general principle of not interfering in other countries' affairs, but the problem here, we're talking about Israel, which is a U.S. client state. Israel is the number one recipient of U.S. foreign aid, billions of dollars per year. A lot of that is funneled back into the U.S. military-industrial complex. At the UN, whenever there's an international effort to get Israel to comply with international law by withdrawing from the territories that it's occupied for decades, by getting it to respect Palestinians' minimal human rights, the U.S. vetoes these resolutions, dozens of vetoes going back decades. So the U.S. plays a critical role here in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I'm not asking the U.S. to interfere in Israel's politics. I'm just asking Israel to stop supporting apartheid and something worse than apartheid. And the U.S., if it changes policies, could make a huge difference on the ground, because without U.S. protection, without being under the U.S. umbrella, Israel could not do what it's doing. But Joe Biden, because he doesn't care about human rights despite what he says, is willing to go to Israel, pledge his fidelity to an apartheid government, and essentially continue the policies of Donald Trump, who was supposed to be the person he was going to make a sharp turn from.
And Rand Paul has actually been against some of this aid, I think, then joining probably, I assume, some of the further left Congressman Ilhan Omar type people.
Yeah, these progressive lawmakers haven't been entirely silent here. And I think some leftists warned that a Joe Biden administration could lead to a world where people on the whole, Democrats on the whole, were less attentive to the policies, to your point, Aaron, which under Donald Trump attracted so much scorn. At the same time, these progressive policymakers do speak up. They tend to get railroaded by super PACs like DMFI and other Israel-aligned PACs, like what we're seeing with Rashida Tlaib right now, where Bakari Sellers is heading up a PAC trying to get her ousted from her seat. I mean, what do you make of the state of the kind of pro-Palestinian advocacy in the United States under the Biden administration?
Well, certainly things have changed from how they used to be. Jesse Jackson, when he ran for president, he openly advocated a Palestinian state. And for that, he was bitterly attacked and condemned as an anti-Semite. You can't do that anymore, although it's still very vicious. And that's why people like Rashida Tlaib have come under harsh attack. But things have opened up more now for more dissent. So you have members of Congress who can say the basic humane position, which is that we shouldn't be supporting occupation and apartheid. But it's still bad. I mean, look, Israel just killed an American citizen, Shireen Abu Akleh, a journalist with Al Jazeera. What has the U.S. done in response to that? They're essentially saying, oh, we can't say for sure that it was Israel who did it. We can't say for sure that Israel did it. They probably did it, but we can't say for sure. And they're not seeing any real accountability, to the point where Shireen Abu Akleh's family asked to meet with Biden on his trip to Israel and Palestine. And I believe Biden has rejected that request. So it is very difficult. But luckily, I think the public has grown more aware of what the reality was. There was a long time when anybody who spoke out about it was just dismissed as crazy or an anti-Semite. That's not possible anymore, just given all the information that's come out and what's happening in front of our eyes. But yes, as you say, it's still a challenge, and people who speak up do face all sorts of disingenuous attacks.
You know, we're watching a very interesting shift on where the two parties stand on some foreign policy issues to some degree. You mentioned, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The only opposition, to the extent that there's any opposition to continuing to fund the Ukrainian opposition in Congress, the only opposition is coming from Republican, not all of a minority of the Republican members, probably the ones you would most deem far right or whatever that label means. And then you've had some sentiment of opposition also among the kind of Democrats we're talking about, but the votes were really coming from this group of Republican legislators. I understand that on Israel it's still quite different. The Republican Party, the Trump Republican Party, remained extremely supportive of Israel and aid to Israel, Rand Paul being a massive outlier there. But I'm wondering, given this, this greater understanding among some political figures in the Republican Party, that their base, broadly speaking, does not want to fund foreign conflicts and other governments, probably whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Israel, there's probably more appetite for not doing that among the Republican base than Republican leaders have historically realized. Some leaders have realized, perhaps, or are starting to realize. So I wonder if you think we're going to continue to see this switch where Democrats are the party of funding our allies, our humanitarian allies, or whatever it is, and Republicans are more skeptical of this kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't expect the Democratic Party to evolve much on the question of Israel-Palestine, as Joe Biden is just displaying right now. Nancy Pelosi has said that if Israel didn't create itself, then the U.S. would have to create it. So there's a huge amount of fidelity to the Israeli occupation from the establishment Democrats. And you have people at the fringes of the party like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders, too, who have been speaking up more. But whether or not that evolves depends on what kind of people are elected to Congress. And certainly the leadership, I don't see that changing. And on the Republican side, it's difficult because you have that evangelical component where a lot of Christian evangelicals love Israel because they see Israel as the site one day of Christ's return, and then we're going to have the Armageddon, and then Jews like myself will be slaughtered. But they paper over that part because for now, Israel works for them. So it's complicated. But overall, yes. Is it worrying that zero Democrats, including Bernie Sanders and the squad, voted against the Ukraine proxy war bill? $40 billion, a lot of that going to the military-industrial complex. Also, the Lend-Lease Act. Zero Democrats voted against it. All of them voted for it. That is a worrying trend. And we're in a tough position where we have to rely on the fringes of both parties to occasionally be decent on really vital issues. It's ominous.
Well, Aaron, I'm certainly glad you're still with us, and I thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back with more Rising. Stay tuned.